Hey folks, Mr. Law back here. I put together this video on the Great Awakening, which took place in the Americas from 1730 to the 1770s in the English colonies. So I'm going to define the Great Awakening, explain how it's connected to the Enlightenment, what evangelicalism was and the role that it played in the Great Awakening and in colonial society. We're going to talk about two key figures from the Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, and what their contributions were. We're going to compare and contrast the old lights and the new lights and their stance on the Great Awakening. And then we'll conclude by talking about the impacts of the Great Awakening and how it helped to plant the seeds for what later would be revolution and independence of the English colonies from Great Britain. So the Great Awakening from 1730 to 1770s, but the most prominent time period was in the 1730s through the 1740s. The Great Awakening, what was it? It was a progressive religious revival that spread throughout the colonies where many people were converted to Christianity. So you have to remember that early on in colonial period, religion was very, very important, and as does typically happen, that importance kind of waned a little bit, and the Great Awakening was this revival of religious sentiments. Increased importance in Christianity, challenges to traditional authority in religion began to happen. Churches lost some of their authority. It was a reaction to the Enlightenment, which was happening in Europe at the time, in the 17th century and the 18th century, where human reason and thinking were paramount over religious beliefs and the teachings of the Bible. The print culture allowed for people in America to get this information from what was going on in Europe, so they were able to follow the Enlightenment. Beliefs in predestination, the Puritan belief, became less important. There was a belief that salvation could happen for everybody and you controlled your own afterlife. Evangelicalism increased. People began to live directly through the Bible and tried to convince other people to live a life that is dictated in the Bible. There were many people that were born again or, quote, saved, and they tried to spread the word of the gospel to others. Now, two of the key individuals from the Great Awakening were Jonathan Edwards. He's given credit for starting the Great Awakening. He is probably the most popular or most important preacher in American history. His most well-known sermon, Sinners, Hands of an Angry God, was a combination of fire and brimstone, Enlightenment ideas tied in with religion, very powerful, almost scary type of a sermon. This sermon was very important. He was situated in Northampton, Massachusetts, and preached with a lot of popularity in that region. Conversely, George Whitefield introduced a new energized style of evangelical preaching from England. He was what was known as an itinerant preacher, where he went around the entire eastern seaboard, and he said that ordinary people didn't need ministers in order to have tremendous religious experiences. He was a very charismatic speaker. It was said that Benjamin Franklin heard him speak, and he literally emptied his pockets with everything he had to give to Whitefield. Again, he was all over the country as opposed to John Edwards, who was just in New England. Both men were famous throughout the colonies, though, for their part in the Great Awakening. The two most important figures in the Great Awakening. New lights and old lights. In the Great Awakening, the supporters were often referred to as new lights. They believed in emotionalism. They were more progressive. They took a less traditional look at religion and the power of the church. They believed that democracy and democratic views were a very important part of society. They began to question colonial authority, like, hey, back in Europe, why are they ruling us over here? So among new lights, this type of a mentality was pretty common. Old lights, on the other hand, they were against the Great Awakening. They resisted this emotionalism. They favored more traditional religious practices. They believed that religious had to go back to the way it was during the earlier colonial periods. Some of the impacts of the Great Awakening. New Light universities were formed. They didn't go by these names at the time, but Dartmouth, Princeton, and Brown, to name a few of them. So institutions of higher learning. More branches of Christianity emerged, more denominations. There was religious diversity. More African Americans became converted and involved in religion. Remember that the colonies were very diverse and operated almost as their own individual country. So the Great Awakening was the first unifying experience for the colonists. Also strengthened calls for separation of church and state. This was in the vein of the Enlightenment, freedom of speech. All of these were impacts of the Great Awakening, which a few decades later would help to ignite the American Revolution and calls for independence.